Well, shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malaman in Highland Park, New Jersey at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining me as always, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter, Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Anshe Chesed in New York. It's great to see you.
Great to be here.
Parsha Bo, Parsha Bo. Can we think of a much more complicated, interesting, story-laden, consequential Parsha than Parsha Bo?
Not this week.
Because next week there'll be another consequential Parsha. Well, we have to bring everyone up to date. Parsha Bo picks up where last week Vayera left off. We were at plague 7 last week, and now we are doing plagues 8, 9, and 10. Arbeh, Choshech, and the ultimate, Makat Becharot. So let's try and get into try and set up the frame here, set up the picture of both the Israelites, the Egyptians, and Pharaoh. I want to turn to you, Barry. I want to ask you what is going through Pharaoh's mind, what is going through the Egyptians' mind, and what is going through the Israelites' mind, and thinking in terms of the anticipation here, and in terms of both the plagues and what's going to happen soon.
You know, it's such a wonderful question because we are literary people and we read the book, and everything happens very quickly in a book, right? You turn the page and things happen. But we have to try and think about how this is actually unfolding in real time. And there has to be some kind of gap between the plagues, something that allows them to leaven, as it were, and to marinate in order to have their effect. So last week we end with the hail, which I assume is a springtime plague, and locust I assume is a few weeks later at least. But the locusts come to finish the job that the hail began. The hail was one of these history-making events. The language is that nothing like this had happened since time immemorial, and it destroyed the land. But it couldn't have destroyed all of it because the locusts are going to come and clear the rest of it away, such that the magicians are going to say to Pharaoh in their language, Ganug.
Yeah.
Oh, that's our language.
I want to focus in. Let me focus in on one pasuk, okay? Because I think it speaks to something. So, Vayushav et Moshe v'et Aaron al Paro. Moses and Aaron go back to Paro. Vayomer aleichem. Pharaoh says to them, Lechu ivdu et Adonai Elohechem. Mi v'mi haolchim. Who's going? And the answer, Moshe's answer, Binarenu uvizkenenu lelech. Any thoughts on that verse?
It takes a village to raise an exodus. You need an entire community.
So the pretense of the exodus is to go out and worship in the desert, and Pharaoh is saying, just take the men and worship, and Moshe is saying, and this is so remarkable. He's saying, we're going as a people, man. We're going, young and old, men and women. We're taking our sheep, our cattle, everything. It's a totality. We are a complete entity. This is not about being, a special delegation. This is about everybody in the people going. And Pharaoh says, no, let the men go. And so the plague then comes. That's our bet. The locusts, okay? Going to Choshech. Go comment.
But it's extremely rich, though. I love what you said about the whole nation, and because this Parsha, and we'll talk about this, does culminate in the family celebration that is the covenantal ritual in Judaism, and everybody has to participate. But it is interesting that what you just said reminds me of the fact that Moshe has been telling Pharaoh a deception this whole time, which is, we're going to go to worship 3 days in the desert. Not, we're leaving and we're never coming back. So Pharaoh's response of, well, can a delegation go, is actually totally reasonable in its own terms, especially since he's got to think, and by the way, Moses also he's got to think, And this will be reinforced again in Moses' later comment that this is a ritual for communal leaders. Because, Moshe begins in 12, when he's speaking about the Pesach ritual, he gathers up the leaders and says, okay, everybody take a lamb. So probably in ancient times, leaders participated in ritual, but not everybody. Now, but Moshe is going to say, in a way that should be moving to a Jew, this is for us all.
That is, I think, one of the most salient observations, that the Torah itself democratizes the religious experience. There are, of course, we'll see this in Vayikra, impulses within the establishment, the administration, leaders, ecclesiastical authorities to take over. But this belongs to the people. This experience belongs to the people.
And as a result, this sacrifice is a home-based sacrifice.
Yeah.
In later Israelite religion, this could become a problem when the sacrifice has to be transferred to the temple. Yeah. But the home is for everyone.
So hold that for a second. We're going to go through Choshech. Comment, Jeremy. Ulachol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. How many sermons have you given?
You gotta love it. The Egyptians, we talked last week about, this might have actually been in our pre-show conversation. Elliot, you referenced the embalming practices and the hardness of the heart. Pharaoh's heart is heavy, which indicates a sense of moral guilt, right? Yes. And the Egyptians have a whole country, have a whole culture, have a whole empire full of darkness. Vayamesh choshech, it's so dark you could touch it. Nobody could stand up. And the Israelites have light in all their dwellings. The oppressors have the darkness and the depth. The oppressed have the light.
It's such a remarkable thing. And it's also...
This is the first Or LaGoyim.
Indeed. There's these lovely comments, when we're together, there's light among us. Okay,
Moshe, by the way, at the very beginning, we got the question of Moshe's name. Like Pharaoh, the baby's kept for 3 months, hidden for 3 months. They put in the basket, and then Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and then she names him Moshe. Actually, to tell you the truth, what the Bible says is that the sister takes him back to weaning. When he grows bigger, approximately 2 years perhaps, then it goes back to Pharaoh's daughter, and then she names him Moshe, Kimin Hamayim Mishitiu, for I drew him out of the water. Well, what did they call him for the previous things? And it says, what did they call him? Hey, you, for the first, 2.5 years of his life. So the Torah says when Moshe is born, Vatero Toki Tovhu, the mother sees that he's good. So the Talmud says, Tov, first of all, she might have called him Tov, or she might have called him Tuvia, but they called him Tov because the whole house was filled with light when he was born.
Yeah.
So you have that sense that, like creation, God looks at the light, Vayarta or Ki Tov. So you see the light, you see the goodness, you see the possibility, and that is replicated a little bit in this sense of the plague of darkness for the oppressors and light for the Israelites.
All right. So we now need to talk about Makat Bechorot. It's introduced, chapter 11, verse 1. Od nega achad avi al paro. God says to Moses, I'm going to bring one more. It's going to be devastating. And before they send you out, everybody, tell the people to get clothing from the Egyptians. We're not going to dwell on that necessarily. But he says, Kachatzot halayla, in the middle of the night, Ani yotze betoch Mitzrayim. I'm going out to Egypt. Umet kol bechor be'eretz Yisrael, and all the firstborn are going to die, etc. And this is Makat Bechorot.
God does that?
This is what it says.
Ani velo malach. I am no angel. I am no saraf.
There you go.
God's self is doing this.
Absolutely. And what's the purpose? Why the firstborn? Well, we could talk about that, but obviously it's going to be a devastating set of events. And then the Torah takes us into the ritual. This is one of the most fascinating passages, I think, in the book of Shemot, early Torah. Achodesh hazeh lachem. Rashi says that the Torah should have started here because it's the first mitzvah given to Bnei Yisrael. So we got to describe this. What's going on in this passage, chapter 12? What is going on? Jeremy.
So I love the fact that up at this point, I mean, there's a bit of an exaggeration or an oversimplification, but maybe only a bit, is that we've now been telling the prehistory, and now we become a religion. Now we become a people with a set of sacred practices that are trying to inscribe meaning and goodness and holiness and spiritual and ethical aspirations on our people. You get the first commandment is how to count time. Okay, you have been a slave. You have been an Egyptian culture. You have been bound and constrained by that. You now are going to count your own calendar by this month of liberation, which is itself very interesting. And then Moshe gives them instructions about how it is that they will celebrate this covenantal meal. Davru kol adat Yisrael. Every household takes a lamb, and if you have a small house, you share with your next door neighbors, or your nearest neighbors, and then you're going to slaughter it on the afternoon. We'll let Elliot darshan out a whole rich version of this story in a minute, but you slaughter it in the afternoon, because at sunset or in the dark, you're going to have a covenantal meal with the blood smeared on the doorpost as you get ready to exit Egypt.
Barry, you want to just weigh in on this passage here?
It remains to me a perplexing passage and somewhat in the wrong place, because the story now moves back 5 days, right? The last plague is going to happen the night of the 14th, and all of a sudden we're now at the 10th, and we're making preparations, so that the story is unfolding on a lot of different levels. We have the chronological time as day by day unfolds, but we also have a retrospective and a look to the future as well, because the chapter is going to conclude with the halachot for Pesach Ledorot, for the Pesach that we're going to observe once we get to the land of Israel, which, as far as we know right now, is on the horizon. It's not until the Midbar that we're going to realize that we're going to be stuck for 40 years before we get to celebrate Pesach in the land of Israel itself. And, you know, I struck when we were talking earlier, Elliot, by the importance that you attach to the covenantal meal, that this really is the driving force here of Pesach. It's the only home sacrifice that we have in the Bible. And it also prefigures the Seder, which I mentioned somewhat jokingly. You know, for many Jews, the key to the Seder is the meal. They rush through the Magi part of the Haggadah, which is the story, which for the rabbis is the heart of the Seder, to get to the meal. And maybe they really understand the essence of Pesach, which is this covenantal meal, this breaking of bread or crackers as it is, and sharing our bounty in the presence of God. It reminds me of the way that Baruch Levine described the Zevach Shlamim as a sacred meal of greeting. And that's what Pesach is here in chapter 12, and what it will become once the rabbis get a hold of it after the destruction of the temple as well.
So there are so many critical elements to this. I think the key element is bayit, sela bayit, that the family is to sit down and eat. And this is telling us that the experience of freedom and the covenantal association with that meal is mediated through family. It's such a remarkable message of Judaism, that Judaism transmits its covenantal idea through the family. Our good friend Eliezer Diamond, our teacher friend Eliezer and colleague from Ramah, he made a remarkable point in one of his talks. He said, what slavery does is it shatters the family unit. And it's not an accident that the meal that is to be restorative of people and give the people freedom is centered around the family. I think it's a profound, profound idea that the Passover meal is a meal that is restorative to the family. And if you just want to take a second on the experience of African-American slavery in this country, what was devastating about it, as slavery is in every circumstance, is the shattering of the family unit. It's crushed. And so what Israel is doing here through the Korban Pesach is reconstituting its family centrality. Second, the head of the household becomes a kind of Kohen, because the head of the household is slaughtering the animal. So when it says, Vatem tiuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, yeah, every single family gets its own Kohen. And so in a sense, what you have wrapped into the whole Korban Pesach experience is the formation of Judaism. Barry.
Yeah. What I wanted to add is that this covenantal meal also requires a fixed time, that the meal has a beginning and it has an end. There aren't going to be any leftovers from this meal by design. Whatever is left over has to be destroyed. And I think it makes an important lesson teaches an important lesson about freedom, that freedom isn't leisure time, the time when you can do whatever you want. Freedom is really being able to fix time. Just like the calendar was fixed with the establishment of what we call Nisan the first month, the meal is fixed because it's bounded. And that is critical to our understanding of what freedom really is, which ultimately is submission to the true master rather than the human master that in our story here we call Pharaoh.
Okay, so take us into the map out this evening. We have a debate about this, but go ahead.
You should map it out, but I just wanted to say because you've got a very full rendering, but I just want
a full plate.
That Barry said a very full plate, but Barry said, earlier about the sort of folk Seder, and there's 4 questions, but really there's 5 questions on Pesach. And the most important 5th question, of course, is
when do we eat?
When do we eat? And those of us who love Jewish texts and love talking about the Saper B'Siyat Mitzrayim can get frustrated. But I do think that what Barry said is right on. That it is about eating, and in fact about the symbolic food. What does Rabban Gamliel say? Is that Kol Shelo Amar, anyone who didn't talk about 3 foods, Lo Yatzai Yedei Chovah, didn't fulfill the obligation. That is Pesach Matzah U'Maror. You have to give a little midrash about the 3 foods. And I want to just point out that in the course of Shemot 12, I actually think that this is a pshat in the Bible that all the way back, it is talking about symbolic foods. So in verse 20, in verse 26, I think here, I can't see with my eyes, they're not so good. When your children will ask you, what is this worship? In our Haggadah, that's in the mouth of the Rasha, but it's really the most important question. What is the meaning of this worship? Amartem zevach pesach Adonai. You will say, this is the offering. And so all the way back in the Bible, even in Exodus chapter 12, the very first time we hear about this, the description is that the food is symbolic of a story, which I just think is just super profound. Again, in the turn from stories about the ancestors to a description of religion as we live it.
Okay, so now we got to map out the evening. And I'm going to propose the following. So the Torah tells us exactly how this evening is going to happen. And it tells us, I think, what happened. How it's supposed to happen is that the head of household, to gather their household, they are supposed to be inside. They are supposed to slaughter the animal at dusk. The animal gets slaughtered, it gets dressed, that is, and roasted. It's roasted whole, okay? Now, I am not an expert in the roasting of animals, but
Rabbi Malamit's a vegan.
I am a vegan, okay. But in my pre-vegan days, and from my just perusal of this topic, it takes an awful lot of time to roast an animal. It takes 2.5 hours to roast a sizable turkey. It takes a good couple of hours to roast a brisket. An 8 to 10 pound brisket takes at least a couple of hours. You're talking about a 60, 70 pound, maybe even larger, roasted lamb here. It's got to take a lot of time. I showed you a video before of this woman in Philadelphia who makes barbacoa, which is a food that I'll never eat, but looks amazing. It roasts all night. It just cooks and cooks. And when you eat it, it's just amazing. So they're supposed to eat a meal. And I predict that the meal would have been ready by around midnight. Okay. So they slaughter it at dusk. It's ready to be eaten at midnight. It's supposed to be eaten al matzot u'marim, with bitter herbs and with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And then what happens? I draw your attention to chapter 12, verse 29. Vayehi b'chatzi halayla. It's in the middle of the night. So I'm reckoning that midnight is midnight. It's at the moment that they are about to eat the meal, to get ready to go, to leave on a full stomach because they're going on the journey. They've been told that. They know that there's a terrible havoc going on in Egypt. It is happening. They stayed inside. They've protected their household by the blood on the doorpost. It's in the middle of the night, and Paro summons Moshe and Aaron and says, get out of here. Kumu su'u mitoch ami. Get out of my nation. Gamatem, gam b'nei Israel. You and the people of Israel. L'chu yivdu. Get out of here. Go and worship. And so they go. And they don't eat the matzah till the next morning. Okay? So they leave. I believe that they left with the lamb still roasting. And they went, and this is the miracle. The miracle of the Exodus is that the entire Jewish people went a night without food.
and that was the last time that ever happened. But Elliot, I think that the second time you've told us this story was even more powerful than the first. And I think what speaks to me now is that when I teach about matzah in high school, I like to refer to matzah as interrupted bread. That matzah is something where we as human beings, as Jews, we have to interrupt a natural process in order to make matzah. Matzah cannot happen naturally. And the way you describe the meal then is that the meal this night in Egypt is an interrupted meal. And so the matzah that we eat is a beautiful symbol of that interrupted meal and gives a lot of punch, I think, to the way that you told this story.
So the people of Israel starts with a disruption, a tremendous disruption from slavery to freedom. And also, I think the fact that they're leaving on an empty stomach rather than a full stomach enhances the rebirth of the people. That is to say that the next day, the matzah is the first food that they eat. And matzah, as symbolic as it is, takes on even more symbolism because it's the first food eaten in freedom.
Right. But here what's interesting is that the way you describe it now suggests that there's a lot of yearning that goes into this leaving of Egypt. Yeah. But when we track the path of our ancestors through the wilderness, they often complain about the lack of food and they want to go back to Egypt. They don't want to go back to this last night in Egypt when they had their own roast lamb. They want to go back to slavery. So there's a tenuous connection between food and freedom that we have to be vigilant about keeping.
You're right. That's a profound. They're longing for all the foods that they imagined that they had, a kind of sense of satiation and satisfaction. But here the remarkable moment is that they leave as one.
One of the things that is to me an interesting ramification of what you've just said is that the Jewish people's experience then of religion begins more with unfulfilled commandments than with fulfilled commandments, because they were commanded to eat this meal in celebration.
Perfect. Yeah.
And according to your chronology of it, they never got there. They were commanded to eat matzah that night. And so maybe the first thing that they did in the crisis, in this COVID era, we say about all the ways in which we've deviated from normal Jewish practice and we don't do things the way we would like to do. We say, well, it's shat hadechak. This is an emergency situation. And we do have this concept in halacha that, you can respond to certain crises with what would ordinarily be unusual behavior. And maybe what you're saying is that the first thing to do, they get all these mitzvot, and right away, Shat HaDechak prevents them from doing the mitzvahs.
Yeah. But then the first thing that they're able to do is the mitzvah of matzah, which almost prompts the question, I like to have this conversation with people. What's the first thing you're going to do after this is over? You know what most people are saying? It's not, they're going to take a trip. They're going to go, and it tells us how significant travel is. And of course, seeing family and seeing everybody. When this is over, what are you going to do? What's the first thing that you crave? And we've been doing mitzvot all along, but what we've been missing is the extension of our family. And that sense of community that is encapsulated in our families is what defines us as a people. And I think, of course, it's shared by all people.
Now this really touches, though, also on what you were saying about the midnight character, the ritual. The two of us were pushing back on you before the show started, but the midnight character of the ritual, during the plague of Choshech, the Egyptians could not see each other.
Yeah.
And that was the very nature of the plague. And in contrast, when you were saying about what will you do when this is over, I had a conversation today with somebody from the shul who, we can see each other insofar as we've got, these video chats, but she was talking about, having not seen her grandbaby children, in their, missing a whole year of seeing that kid in their toddlerhood. The first thing that person wants to do is get on a plane and go to California and see their grandchild
and inhale them. They're going to squeeze them. That's deeply human, of course, and it's universal. I mean, this is what we all share with people who are experiencing this. We got a few seconds left. We have to explore the 13th, the end of the Parsha, because, and Jeremy, you touched on it, the didactic, the pedagogical function of the ritual. I mean,
I've got a visual aid. You keep talking. I'm going to show you a visual aid. You shall tell your children, or tomorrow, if your child asks you, what are you doing, ma'azot? And of course, we derive the four children from the Haggadah from these passages. But can you just tell me how this functions in as a central piece of Judaism? Well, I want to tell you that these two passages, the two quote unquote paragraphs of Exodus 13, along with Shema and V'hayim Shamoa, are in your
fill-in.
And as my visual aid. So here's a head tefillin.
There you go.
And you can see that there's four passages inside the head tefillin.
Very nice.
And here's for the hand tefillin. Maybe our listeners know this or don't know this. For the head tefillin, there's four passages on four scrolls. In the hand tefillin, it's four passages on a single scroll. And here I have my open pair of tefillin.
Beautiful. That's great.
There we go.
This is a first Parsha Talk.
a little. So how do these things play in the practice of Judaism? First of all, there is the image of our future children who will receive a story from their ancestors. And that is so, could anything be more central about Judaism than that? We relate the memories of our people, the sacred memories of our people, one generation to another. And my favorite ritual mitzvah is tefillin, and we actually symbolically inscribe it on our bodies. This is, miyamim yamima, from time immemorial. We make it on our hands and our heads. Hey, what we didn't do? We did get a good question from Carol Chesterman. We didn't answer it about the symbolism of the sort of matzah. Is it the freedom? Is it slavery? Is it rich? Is it poverty? And I think we're just probably going to have to wait until Pesach.
No. Purity, intentionality, and freshness in some. That's what matzah is all about. But we'll have to do that at Pesach. Barry, weigh in on anything.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Passover
as education.
So I guess, what occurs to me, listening to you talk about the four sons, and this question, Mazod, is a great question, because we all have had the experience of kids watching us do something and say, why are you doing this? And it doesn't ever seem all that unnatural. So if you'll indulge me, I'll tell one of my favorite stories. A little girl's watching her mother make a roast, and she cuts the corner of the meat off before she puts it in the pan. And she asks her mother, why does she do this? And the mother says, I don't know, but that's what my mother did. So she calls the grandmother, and the grandmother says, that's what my mother did. She calls the great-grandmother, and the great-grandmother laughs and said, I don't know why they did it. I did it because the pan was too small.
Yeah.
And the wisdom in the story is that we do things that we see. A lot of teaching we sometimes forget is modeling behavior. It's not always, and I had the experience, I assume many people did, where parents in a certain sense of frustration would say, do what I say, not what I do. Right? They never say, do what I do, not what I say, because it's always the behavior that's wanting. And we sometimes forget that education is ongoing, because we always have to teach, because children are always new and fresh, and they see things with eyes that we forget what it was like to see things with those fresh eyes.
I think it's a remarkable note to conclude with, which is that this whole the ritual and the study is a modeling behavior. That dynamic itself transmits to subsequent generations, and I have to say, even our little conversation here, we have this from week to week, I'm getting a lot of reactions from big fans. I want to big shout out to all of our fans who listen to us completely. We thank you so much for joining us for this during this time. We really appreciate you spending time with us, and your comments and remarks to all of us. We really, really enjoy them. We are so glad to be a part of your week and your study of Torah and your Shabbat. So on the 21st day of the 21st year of the 21st century, right? They were recording it January 21st here. But Mazel Tov to the new president, Mazel Tov.
And to the Doug Emhoff, the Yiddish first gentleman or second gentleman.
Lots of Jewish milestones over the last couple of days. But our milestone, we're here. We're almost a year through the pandemic and Parsha Talk, but we're going to see you next week. Before that, I want to say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.